Just a minute. Yeah. I hope people are joining, but we'll have to start.
Okay. Okay.
Sir,
Okay.
is my laser pointer also visible to you?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, then a very good afternoon and welcome to the SGT SGI monthly e-lecture. Today we have Dr. Sreyashi Bhowmick as a speaker who is going to deliver a talk on understanding the properties, mechanism and behavior of plate boundary faults. So before jumping into the talk, let me briefly introduce our today's speaker. Dr. Sreyashi completed her PhD from ISI Kolkata, if I'm not wrong,
Uh,
under ISI Kolkata, am I right?
no, sir, Jadavpur
Oh,
University.
Jadavpur University. I think with Professor Tridip Mandalda, right?
Yes.
Okay. Then she joined Tel Aviv University for a postdoc. Very recently, she moved to Indian Institute of Geomagnetism as an NMRF postdoctoral fellow. With this, now I request Shreyasi to deliver her presentation. Over to you, Shreyasi.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Uh, I'm really thankful and grateful to the whole SGT-SGI community for giving me this platform to present my work. So today I'll be presenting my research work, which I have carried out in the Geological Survey of Israel and Tel Aviv University. So the title goes, Understanding the Properties, Mechanisms, and Behavior of Plate Boundary Faults. Now we know that Earth is a dynamic planet. And why is it so? Because of the plate motions. So when we think about the tectonic plates or the plate boundaries, we know that they are defined by faults. In order to understand the behavior of these plate boundary faults, we need to know about the properties and mechanisms behind it. So on that note, we need to know about the fault zones and why are they important to us. First of all, fault zones gives us a unique opportunity to study the upper crustal deformation, and also we can use the fault slip data for paleostress reconstruction. So if we are interested to know about the stress fields that prevailed in the geological past, then this fault slip data, it gives us a unique opportunity again. Hydrocarbon exploration, mineral resources, earthquake and landslide mitigation. And in the modern era, we are searching for a stable basement for nuclear waste management and carbon sequestration. So all of these factors makes studying fault zones very important for us. Now, what are fault zones? Fault zones consist of intensely deformed fault rocks. So if we look at the basic architecture of the fault zone, here we can see this black line, it defines the principal slip zone, which contains the slip surfaces. And then this yellow material is basically the powdered incohesive mass, which is derived by crushing the fault zone rocks. Then we have the fault breccia, which are basically the angular broken fragments. And with increasing depth, we can see cohesive cataclasites and pseudotachelites within the fault core. So all of these constitutes the fault core, which is intensely deformed. Now, we have the damage zones which envelops this fault core. And if you look here, we can find a lot of fractures. So it is replete with fractures of different orientation. Now, the strain field is maximum here, and it gradually diminishes as we reach the undeformed host rock. So this is the basic architecture. Now, if we look at a field example, so this is from the Dead Sea Fault, the southern part of the Dead Sea Fault, and this is called the Rodded Fault. And here you can see the fault gouge, then we have the cataclysmites. So this defines the core, and then we have the damage zone, which is intensely fractured. Now, I will show some field examples from the Dead Sea fault system. So if we look at the Dead Sea fault, and if we focus on the plate tectonic configuration, we can see that here, this is the Dead Sea fault. And on one side, we have the Arabian plate. On the other side, we have the Sinai subplate, which is a part of the African plate. And in the north, we have the Eurasian plate. Now, coming down south here, we have the Red Sea rift. So here there's extensional tectonics. And in the northern part, the African plate and the Arabian plate, they are merging with the Eurasian plate. So here we have a compressional tectonics. So the DSF is very strategically located in between the three plates. So it has an overall north-south trend covering almost 1,000 kilometers from Turkey in the north to Red Sea in the south, and it has a sinistral strike-slip motion. Now, there are several active and seismic segments along this fault. Now, apart from the Dead Sea fault here you can see the Sea of Galilee, and we have another fault system. This is kind of a subsystem, which is called the Galilee fault system, and this is connected to the Dead Sea fault. Now, today I will show two examples, one from this Galilee subsystem and the other one from the Dead Sea fault system. So let's start with the Nahaf East fault, which is one of the major young and active faults of this Galilee system. And this is a surface rupture. So you can see the strike of the fault is more or less west-northwest, east-southeast, and it covers a long area, almost extending up to 10 kilometers. But we have studied this particular segment, which has records of 3 seismic events. So the rock type is carbonate, and in the footwall we have the limestone, and in the hanging wall we have the chalks, and this is an oblique slip normal fault. Now, the 3 recorded seismic slip events in this zone makes this area very much vulnerable. Now, if you look here, we can see the settlements. So this is a very risky zone, and the government is planning to rehabilitate these people from this region. So a lot of work is going on. Now, other than some slick and side lineations, we do not see any other strain markers along this fault surface. But if we take a closer look here, we can see some fracture sets. And we can also see fractured calcite grains and evidence of intense grain crushing, grain comminution, which is pretty common along fault surface. And this is also an evidence for shearing along the fault surface. Now let's move to the major strand, one of the major strands of the Dead Sea fault. This is called the Kiryat Shmona fault, and this is very close to the Lebanon border. So this is exactly at the northern extremity of Israel. And if we stand here, there's a quarry. On both sides, the fault scarps are exposed, and we can see straight away the Lebanon border from here. So this particular fault, it again consists of limestones, and apart from a few slick and side lineation, we again do not see any strain markers. But this is a more evolved and matured fault as compared to the Nahaf East fault. Now, if we move down south of the DSF, here there's an extensional tectonic. So we see a lot of graben structures, and we also see a normal faulting around this region. And this also preserves, I will show you another field example here. In this region, we have excellent preservation of the fault cores. So you can see this is the fault gouge material, and this is there are also evidence for clay smearing within the core. So this is how the faults look in and around the Dead Sea. Now, what is the problem here? As I already mentioned, that there are several seismic segments along the Dead Sea fault. However, and we also have a lot of data, a lot of real-time data, which shows the seismic events. But in between 2 consecutive seismic events, there can be a seismic faulting. But this seismic to a seismic transition is not very well known around this entire fault system. Now, why is it important for us to know about this? First of all, this transition can directly impact the strain field. In addition to this, it also impacts the intensity, the recurrence pattern of the upcoming earthquake. So it is very important for earthquake forecasting, especially in rocks which are devoid of strain markers. It becomes very difficult to monitor this transition. And so we need to understand the faulting process in the best possible way. We are using magnetic fabrics to infer the strain field variation across fault zones, magnetic properties to understand the thermochemical mineral alterations within the fault core, and physical parameters such as temperature, presence of fluid, or we can say fluid interaction, stress condition, and slip rates, which directly affects the transmissivity of the fault core. So these are some of the objectives. Now, coming to the faulting process, it is affected by several factors. For example, frictional heating, which leads to temperature rise, and fluid interaction. Now, together, both of these can lead to mineral alterations along the fault zone and also at the fault surface. So we often find iron enrichment along the fault surface, and which is present in the form of iron oxide coating along the surface. And we also find iron oxide veins. For example, hematite veins are also very common. So this kind of coating is found at the fault surface, and it also sometimes this kind of iron enrichment is found within up to a few centimeters extending within the fault zone. And this can be analyzed through field observation, especially if the coating is visible and we have veins. Sometimes if the coating is very thin, then it's difficult, but we can still use magnetic parameters, geochemical studies, and optical micrographs, microscopic studies. But however, if the coating is very thin, then sometimes while preparing the thin section, we find that this coating can wear off, especially if it is thinner than 1 millimeter or something like that. Now, talking about deformation along and away from the fault surface, we are talking about the brittle faults, shallow crustal faults. So it's obvious that we'll find slip surface, large-scale fracture sets, and also microfractures in calcites in any of the constituent grains, intergranular and intragranular fracturing, and grain size comminution, which is a very clear evidence of shearing. So all of these can be found through field observation or through microscopic studies. Now, apparently, we are looking at a brittle structure, but if we move down to the grain scale, we can see evidence of plastic deformation. For example, reorientation of the constituent minerals, thereby developing crystallographic preferred or shape preferred orientation. And this can happen due to grain rotation. So this is a clear evidence of plastic deformation. And this also defines the magnetic fabrics, which I'll be talking about. Now, apart from this, we also have several evidence for recrystallization. For example, grain boundary migration, subgrain rotation, twinning. So this is very common. And these can be analyzed by using magnetic fabrics and also through SEM EBSD microstructural studies. Now, I have already discussed the problems briefly. Why we are using magnetic methods for studying faulting processes, and what are the problems? Absence of reliable strain markers, limited information regarding seismic to aseismic transition, stable and unstable faulting, monitoring the local strain field variation across fault zones, and understanding the physical parameters that governs faulting. Now, why magnetic methods? It is mostly known that it's reliable, robust, non-destructive, time and cost effective, but above all, magnetic properties or magnetic minerals are extremely sensitive to temperature, strain, and fluids. And therefore, they form good markers for all three of them. So mostly we are using AMS, anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility studies, which is a very well-known petrofabric tool for determining rock fabrics, both primary and secondary deformation fabrics. Now, how does fabric elements respond to stress? So if we have some randomly oriented fabric elements, and when it is subjected to a tectonic stress field, they are reoriented. So they attain a preferred orientation. And this is what defines the anisotropy, structural anisotropy in rocks. So we can say that this anisotropy is controlled either by the crystallographic or the shape preferred orientation of the constituent minerals. So we drilled perpendicular to the fault surface, and we obtained oriented core samples which were subjected to an external magnetic field. So this is the Kappa bridge. And we measured the induced magnetization at 3 perpendicular orientations, as you can see here. So this is the AMS ellipsoid, which is defined by the 3 perpendicular susceptibility axes, K1, K2, and K3. And this can be compared to the strain ellipsoid. So basically, my K1, K2, these 2 axes, it can define the magnetic foliation, which is comparable to the XY plane. So therefore, K3 becomes the pole to it. And K1 is also parallel to the X. That means it is the maximum stretching direction. So this forms the magnetic lineation. Now, apart from these orientations, we also calculate a few more parameters, for example, magnetic susceptibility, and this is dependent upon the mineralogy. So it depends on the constituent diamagnetic, paramagnetic, and ferromagnetic minerals and their proportions. Degree of anisotropy is another parameter which defines the strength of the magnetic fabric or intensity of the deformation. Now, I will quickly move on to the magnetic properties that we have seen in the Nahafist fault. First of all, as I already mentioned, that the Nahafist fault consists of limestones in the footwall block. And we know that limestones are diamagnetic. That means it has negative magnetic susceptibility. Now, coming to this graph, here you can see a relation between the bulk susceptibility and degree of anisotropy. So as I already mentioned, this is controlled by the mineralogy. So the constituent diamagnetic, paramagnetic, or ferromagnetic minerals. So in this case, because it is diamagnetic, it will show negative susceptibility. And this degree of anisotropy, it can be dependent both on mineralogy or upon strain. But here we see a linear relationship between the two. This indicates a control of mineralogy. Now, these locations are along the fault surface, actually at the fault surface, and then we also have some reference locations. So let's see what happens as we move, or how these parameters vary as we move towards the fault surface. So here we see something very interesting, that as we move towards the fault surface, both Km and P' values are gradually increasing. So for a pure undeformed calcite grain, the bulk susceptibility value is somewhere between -11 to -13 into 10 to the power -6 SI. But here we can see that as we approach the fault surface, it increases to close to -2 to -3 into 10 to the power -6 SI. Now, this indicates that there must be some sort of iron enrichment along the fault surface, which is causing this increase. To determine this, we also found the iron content. So here you can see, as we approach the fault surface, both Km value and the iron content increases. So which means that there is maximum iron concentration at the surface. So what are the findings from here? First is, the Km value is increasing or becoming less negative on the fault surface. However, the diamagnetic nature of the rock is being preserved. That means it is still in the negative quadrant. So this can only happen if there is some iron enrichment along the fault surface. But from here, we can understand that there is an iron enrichment, but we need to know the exact phase, the iron bearing phase, for which we performed some high and low temperature magnetic measurements, starting with high temperature thermomagnetic curve. So this helps us to understand the variation of magnetic susceptibility with increasing temperature. Now, in this case, we are measuring a diamagnetic sample with a very thin iron bearing coating. So the curve is pretty noisy, and though it is noisy, we can see some variation in the magnetic susceptibility, but it is not very clearly discernible. In addition to this, when we increase the temperature, what happens is there can be some secondary reactions, the reactions which can cause an alteration in the primary magnetic phase, and it can generate a secondary magnetic phase. So here we can see presence of magnetite, hematite, and maghamite in small amounts, but this is not very conclusive. So on that regard, we had to perform some low temperature studies. So this is low temperature saturation isothermal remnant magnetization curves. In short, these are SIRM curves. So this type of curves, they help us to segregate or distinguish between the iron bearing phases. Let's see how. So this type of measurements are taken in MPMS systems. This is called the magnetic properties measurement system. And usually we apply a very high and stable field. It's close to 5,000 Orsted, and then the field is zeroed down. After the field is zeroed down and it's stable, then we start decreasing the temperature, starting from the room temperature. So here you can see the scale is in Kelvin. So we started at the room temperature and then we considerably went down. So in this case, we can see as we decrease the temperature, there's an increase in the saturation remnants. Now, this is particularly a character of goethite. Not only that, we see that there is a divergence in between the cooling and the warming curves, which is also indicative of goethite. Now, how do we know this? MPMS system has a large data repository where usually they take known artificial laboratory-based samples. For example, hematite or goethite, artificially grown crystals are taken of known composition, and it is measured to obtain these curves. And whenever we have an unknown sample and we get the data, we can easily compare the data with the known curves, and it helps us to analyze, to understand or identify the phase. So in this case also, we could identify the goethite from here. Now, once we identified the goethite, we performed several cooling and warming cycles. And here you can see with increasing temperature, which is close to the room temperature, we can demagnetize the goethite. Now, Neal temperature of goethite, for very fine grained goethite, it is close to the room temperature. So here it gets demagnetized. Once the goethite is demagnetized, we find the presence of maghamite and oxidized nanoparticles of magnetite. So we perform several such cooling and warming cycles. Now from here, we could distinguish between the magnetic phases. Not only that, we could also identify the exact reactions which led to the formation of this kind of goethite coating along the fault surface. Now we know that in most cases, carbonates, they can bear small grains of magnetite, which are basically of sedimentary origin, as a precursor. Now, in our case, the limestones, which belongs to the Barkhokba formation, contain this kind of magnetite grains, and this can undergo solid state diffusion due to frictional heating and produce an intermediate phase, which is maghamite. So this is called maghamitization of magnetite. Now, this maghamite, under the presence of fluid, which is very localized, and frictional heating, can generate goethite coatings along the fault surface. So from here, we can see that how magnetic properties can help us constrain the temperature, the estimated temperature for the faulting process. And also, it can help us to understand the thermochemical alteration. Now, here it also gives an indication for fluid activity along the fault surface. Now, I will move on to the magnetic fabric interpretation across fault zones. Now, why is this important? As I already discussed, we have very few strain markers along the fault surface, and the magnetic fabric helps us to identify variation of strain field across the fault zone. Now, to start with, we will look at the fault surface, and we will see that what sort of magnetic fabric we can find here. So this magnetic fabric, as I already mentioned, it depends on the distribution of the AMS axis. So this is the K1, K2, which defines the magnetic foliation, and K3 is basically the pole to it. So here we see that it forms a nice girdle, and it is subparallel to the overall orientation of this fault surface. So this is regarded as the fault-related deformation fabric. Now, this type of fabric can be obtained from the fault surface, and if the strain field is strong enough, we can also see such fabric extending up to 1 meter within the fault zone. Now, this plot is called the PGR plot. Basically, this shows the distribution of the K1 axis. So P stands for point, G stands for girdle, and R stands for random. So here we can see that the K1, there's an open cluster, but however, together it forms a girdle. So here the distribution is somewhere between point to girdle. Now, if we move away from the fault zone, for example, 50 to 80 meters away, we see that this distribution is changing into clusters from girdle. Now, this type of clusters, they resemble the tectonic strain field. So therefore, it is called the tectonic fabric. And because it shows a perfect cluster, so it is plotted here in the point distribution. Now, if we move further away from the fault zone, say about 2 to 3 kilometers away from the fault surface, we can encounter different types of fabrics. So starting with the weak tectonic fabric, here we find that this more or less subvertical cluster is present, but these clusters, the K1 and K2, they form a kind of girdle which is dispersed along the horizontal plane. So this defines the weak tectonic fabric, and this indicates that the strain field was not very predominant in this region. We also see random distribution of the MS axis, which indicates an isotropic fabric. So this is common in case of undeformed rocks. And we also see the primary fabric of the host rock. So here, the K3 cluster is exactly, it's vertical and it forms a very tight cluster. And the K1, K2 axis forms a girdle along the periphery, which is parallel to the bedding. So this represents the deposition or compaction fabric, which is basically the primary fabric of the rock. And in the PGR plot, we find a perfect girdle. So this whole work has been published in the Journal of Structural Geology. And to support this magnetic study, we have also used microstructural attributes. I will quickly discuss that. So for the Nahaf East fault, we find that there is evidence of grain boundary migration. You can see the lobate grain boundaries here. Now, this kind of grain boundary migration usually takes place at a higher temperature, which is close to, say, above 250 to 300 degrees Celsius. But under the presence of fluids, this can take place at a lower temperature, between 200 to 250 degrees Celsius. And this is evident from the works of Twiss and Rutter and also Ferrin. Now, apart from this, we find that there are evidence for fluid interaction in the Nahaf East fault. I could not show all of the pictures here, but however, this fluid interaction is very localized. It is very localized and it hinders the calcite grain reorientation. So when we look at the CPO, it is very weak. Now, the obvious question is that if the CPO is very weak, then how we are getting a well-defined magnetic fabric, which is controlled by the C-axis of calcite. Now, here we need to consider the scale of observation primarily, and also this phenomenon where we see that the fluid interaction is hindering the calcite grain reorientation. As I already mentioned, the fluids are very localized, and so it can affect only a small region. But when we are looking at the magnetic fabric, it is at a larger scale. So this hindrance is very localized. So from here, we could see that the temperature estimation that we initially made from the thermochemical alteration of magnetite to goethite, it fits well with this temperature range, which is evident from the microstructure. Moving on to the next example, this is from the Kiryat Shmona fault, but here we did not find any mineral alteration primarily due to absence of any fluid. But here we could see excellent twinning in the calcite. So these are basically the large grains. Not only in the large grains, but we could also see this kind of twinning in the smaller grains. So this type of type 4 twinning indicates a high temperature condition between 250 to 300 degrees Celsius. And when we see this type of twinning developing in the smaller grains, this indicates that the stress conditions were also relatively high, close to 100 megapascal, but we didn't see any evidence of fluid. So this occurred at a dry condition. And from previous studies, we know that the faulting occurred at a depth of less than 0.5 kilometer. And here we have a weak but a discernible CPO. Now, if we observe here, the CPO of calcite makes a very low angle with the fault normal. So this is also common in several studies where they show that the C-axis of the calcite is actually shows a parallelism with the K3 axis of AMS. And if you remember that the K3 axis was perpendicular to the magnetic foliation. So that means this is my fault normal. Now, I will quickly come to the next part of the project, which involves understanding the fault core evolution and using magnetic, mineralogical, and isotopic perspectives. So I will only discuss about the magnetic perspectives here. So if we look at this figure here, this field photograph here, on one side, so this shows the fault core, and this is from the southern part of the Dead Sea fault system, as I mentioned. And in the southern part, we have an extensional tectonics. So this shows an excellent preservation of the fault core, and the materials are well preserved here. So on one side, we have the granite. So this is the Neoproterozoic granite, which is basically a part of the Arabian-Nubian shield. And on the other side, we have the carbonate rocks. Now, these carbonate rocks, they have a lot of shale layers. They preserve a lot of shale layers from Devonian to Carboniferous age. And there are few evidence where these shales were dragged into the fault core itself. Now, if we look at the material here, this is red gouge and this is a green material. And we see that this type of vertical bandings of colored material are pretty common in this region. So this is not only in case of the Shlomo fault, but we have several such other examples from different other faults where we see this kind of vertical banding. And another thing here, that this red gouge is always disposed along the granite, and the green material is always along the side of the carbonates. So it appears to be as if this gouge has been formed from the granite, and the green material is somehow related to the carbonates or the shales within the carbonates. However, the source of this material is not very well known. And in addition to this, we do not understand the evolution of this fault core throughout the geological time, which needs to be studied. So with that objective, we tried to determine the bulk composition of these two materials, and we found that it consists of silica, alumina, and iron oxides primarily. If we look at the iron content, we see that the red gouge is enriched with iron as compared to the green ones. Now, primarily, these two materials are dominant with phyllosilicates, and apart from that, we also see traces of iron oxides like hematite and goethite in the red gouge. So coming to the clay mineralogy, we found that the red gouge consists of randomly interlaid elite smectite, and the green material consists of kaolinite. So from here, we can say that these two materials, which is present in the fault core, are mineralogically distinctive. So this also indicates that they might have been derived from different sources. We were mostly interested in the magnetic properties. So today I'll be covering only that much. So here we tried to investigate the magnetic properties, and we were mostly interested in the red gouge and the green material. So other than these two, we also use the granite fragments and the shales as reference samples. But we did not get a very good signal from the granites, from the green material or the aura shales, but we got an excellent result from the red gouge. So if we look here, this gives us the variation in bulk susceptibility with increasing temperature. So this is a similar curve that I was talking about in my previous slide. So here we can see the variation of bulk susceptibility with increasing temperature. So it increases, and then there's a sharp decline here. And this is at the Curie temperature of hematite. So what is the Curie temperature? The Curie temperature is the threshold temperature after which any of the magnetic material can lose its magnetization. So this presence of magnetite in the red gouge, this might indicate some sort of thermochemical alteration. Apart from this, in the green material, we could not see much signature, but if we look at the cooling curve, so this is the warming curve and this is the cooling curve, we see that there's an increase in the bulk susceptibility. Now, this could be an artifact, or else it can also indicate presence of very fine-grained iron-bearing phases in the clays, which is also very common. Now, we intended to characterize the magnetic mineralogy, for which we perform some advanced magnetic measurements. For example, the low temperature SIRM curves, which I've already discussed. Now, here we could see something unique. First is, this is, as I already mentioned, we applied a stable magnetic field, then the field is zeroed out, and then we reduce the temperature starting from the room temperature up to 20 to 30 Kelvin. So here you can see that as we decrease the temperature, there's a change in the curve. So we see the slope of the curve suddenly changes here at a temperature close to 250 Kelvin to 270 Kelvin. And this is the Morin transition of hematite. Now, what is Morin transition? In case of hematite, we find this is a kind of phase transition or structural transition in case of hematite. Normally, the electron spins in hematite are aligned along the basal plane. And once we cross this temperature range, what happens is that the electron spins are reoriented and they become parallel to the c-axis of the hematite, due to which a weakly antiferromagnetic hematite changes into a very strong antiferromagnetic mineral. So this is distinctive of hematite. Now, if we look at the remaining rest of the curve, we can see that again with decreasing temperature, the remanence magnetization is increasing. So this is again indicative of goethite. And from here, we can say that we could distinguish between the two magnetic phases. And this is very useful when we have more than one magnetic phase. Now, apart from the low temperature SIRM curves, we also perform the hysteresis measurements. Now, what is hysteresis? Hysteresis means lagging behind. So basically, we apply a very stable field to the magnetic grain. And this field is applied until the magnetic grain is saturated. And then the field is reversed from positive to negative. Now, when the field is reversed, we find that there is a lagging in between the applied field and the induced field. And you can see this opening. This opening can keep on increasing based on the nature of the magnetic grain. So say we have a highly coercive grain, which means the coercivity of this grain is very high. This indicates that this grain is resisting the change or the reversal of this field. Now, we perform several now the field here is ramped, and this is called the zero order loop. So the field is ramped multiple number of times. So first a positive field and then a negative field, and a segment of this hysteresis loop is measured separately, which is known as the first order reversal curve. Now this first order reversal curve helps us to see the distribution of coercivity, which is the property by which the magnetic material can resist the change in the magnetic field. So this basically shows the distribution of the coercivity with respect to the interacting fields. Now, what is the purpose of obtaining this hysteresis loop and first order reversal curve? Now, this gives us an added advantage. First is we could determine the hematite grains, but if we want to characterize this magnetic mineral, understand its nature, its behavior, and its grain size, then hysteresis loops and first order reversal curves gives us an added advantage here. If we look here, this data has been obtained from the red gouge particularly. If we look here, we can see a central ridge along the zero axis. So this is basically indicative of single domain hematite. Now we need to know what is a single domain grain and what is a multi-domain grain. Now this is dependent upon the grain size. So in case of hematite, the single domain grains are less than 0.1 millimeter. For multi-domain grains, the grain size is usually greater than 0.1 millimeter, and this is for hematite. But however, this threshold is a bit flexible. Now, what is the characteristic of single domain grain and what is the characteristic of multi-domain grain? Now, in case of single domain grain, we find that the magnetization is uniformly distributed. So all of the magnetic moments, all of the electron spins are aligned towards the same direction. So we have a preferred orientation for the magnetic moment. So say if we subject this grain to a reversal field, what will happen? We need a very strong field to reverse this orientation. But in case of a multi-domain grain, because the grain size is pretty large, that means that the magnetostatic energy is high. So to balance this out or to lower this energy, the grain produces multiple domains within it. And each of these domains has a differently aligned electron spin or magnetic moment. So that means there is no preferred orientation. So when this multi-domain grain is subjected to a reversal field, these magnetic moments can be easily reversed. So that means a single domain grain will have higher coercivity, higher resistance to any change in the magnetic field, and a multi-domain grain will have lower coercivity. So here we can see a similar thing. Because it's single domain hematite, we can see that the coercivity value is gradually increasing. Now, I will quickly talk about the hysteresis properties, starting from the granite to the red gouge. So I already mentioned that we have two materials, the red gouge and the green material. And we suspect that the gouge is somehow related to the granites and the light green material is related to the shales. So we can see some clear evidence here. As we move from the granite to the red gouge, we find that this hysteresis loop is gradually opening up, or it is widening at the center. This indicates presence of a high coercivity mineral, and in this case, it's hematite. Now, if we look at the light green material, we find that the hysteresis loop is more or less closed. Now, this can happen because of presence of paramagnetic grains or superparamagnetic grains, and this is very common in case of shales and clays. So we could not get a very good signature for the green material. And this is also consistent for the shales. Now, if I summarize the thing shortly, so this is basically the Day-Dunlop plot, which shows the relation between the ratios of the hysteresis parameters. So overall, this particular graph is based on the study of Ozdemir and Dunlop, who measured this with the help of artificial hematite grains. And here you can see the field for MD grain, that is multi-domain grain, and ST grain is specified. And this particular line, this mixing line, is also shown in between the MD grain and the ST grain. So when we plotted our data of the granite fragments and of the red gouge, we could see that there's a change from multi-domain to single domain. So a clear change in the magnetic behavior is recorded from the granite to the red gouge, so which indicates grain size reduction from coarse MD grains in the granite fragments to fine SD grains in the red gouge. Now this is attributed to shearing or the faulting process. So we use these magnetic properties, our findings, magnetic properties, to propose this model. And this is also supported by the isotopic data, but I wanted to keep it short, so I did not include that. But overall, we could find that this red gouge is formed from the granitic blocks, and this is a product of faulting. And this is related to the Miocene faulting. So we say that the red gouge is formed during the Miocene faulting, due to the fragmentation, crushing, and grain size reduction of the granite. So we see a grain size reduction from coarse multi-domain grains in the granite to fine ST grains in the red gouge. Now, as the fault propagation continued, it encountered the overlying younger carbonates. And once this happened, the clay layers got tracked into the core. So in the present scenario, present day, we find that on one side we have the granites, then we have the red gouge, then we have the green material, which is basically derived from the shale smear, and then we have the fractured carbonates. So this whole work is under review. Now, apart from this, we also perform experimental simulation to understand seismic slip and its impact on the petrophysical properties of fault cores. So usually these slip experiments, shear experiments, are performed using the rotary shear apparatus. And this gives us an added advantage to regulate the temperature through external furnace. We can also increase the normal stress. We can control the pore pressure. And most importantly, we can change the slip rates. So experiments can be performed at both high slip rate and at low slip rates. And this enables us to understand the transition between seismic and aseismic slip, which I was talking about. Now, we use natural fault gouge samples. And after this kind of shearing experiments, we can also monitor the changes in the microstructure and magnetic properties. So overall, this helps us to understand the faulting process in a better way. To summarize, rock magnetic methods provide a unique understanding of fault behavior. Detailed understanding of faulting processes is possible by combining magnetic methods with experimental and microstructural studies. Magnetic properties can be regarded as strain indicators, geothermometers, and fluid tracers, which I've already discussed during my presentation. And here we could see that how the coarse MD grains are reduced to fine SD grains, and this behaves as a marker for strain along the fault. On that note, these are some of my publications during my PhD and postdoc, and I'm really thankful to all of you for your patient listening.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation, Sreyashi. And now the forum is open for discussion. So please go ahead.
I think I should start
Yeah, you can start, sir.
introducing the speakers to the audience again, for that a discussion can be held properly. So, Sreyashi, it's a wonderful talk that you have presented.
Thank you.
And I could imagine that you have done a very elaborate work on the fault. The kinematics of fault, starting from the field to again going to the lab, and also doing some microstructural studies, which are really of high standard. So, in fact, I could see that there are many things that you have discussed today. Will be of interest to many of us present here, and maybe who will listen to this talk later. Primarily, the strain accumulation during this faulting, the way you describe the response of Gueth height along this. So at this note, just I have a query.
Yes.
You can just measure the magnetic, the property, if it is Guethite only, or you can also check this thing if the specimen.
Yes, sir. We can measure it for any of the oxides, or if we have a sulfide also. For example, goethite, magnetite, maghamites, then pyrrhotites, pyrites, anything. So it has to have some iron. It can be an iron oxide or an iron sulfide, and there is a large database, and we can obtain the curves and we can compare it to identify the exact magnetic phase.
Okay. So another thing is just I want to know what's the depth of and the influence of this strain from the slip surface to its depth.
So
what-
you're talking about
Yeah. No, what I mean to say is that at what depth this strain in the rock can be expected. The ductile strain that you are talking about, right? Plastic strain.
yes.
That's what I'm asking. Because
Sir,
otherwise it could be all in a brittle field. What we generally know.
Sir, if I could understand your question, you are asking about the depth up to which
Yeah.
we can measure this. So, according to my understanding, though I'm not very sure, but because I worked on the shallow crustal faults, it is well applicable for shallow crustal faults.
No. That I am not asking. I am asking because you have a fault core, then you
Yes.
have a host rock.
Yes,
In
yes,
between them, you have a damage zone.
yes,
So
yes.
for the fault core, this can be done only within the fault core. your strain, ductile strain measurement or something like this?
No, it can be done elsewhere also. If we have a kind of gradient, but it is more prominent in the core because we know that the strain field is maximum in the core. But if we have a good strain field and if it varies, because we are measuring this based on the variation. So we have a multi-domain grain in the granite, and then we have a single domain grain in the gouge. So this gives us a good like end members to measure it. So if we have this kind of end member, we can easily measure it. It
So
depends
you,
on the strain field actually.
another thing is this. That means you will be measuring this thing in preferably in the gauge zone, right?
Yes, yes,
So you
yes,
said one thing you said is incohesive gauge.
yes, sir.
Whether it is really you can really measure the strain orientation of the magnetic material in incohesive gauge.
Yes, it was not a problem in this case because we had this vertical bandings of first we had the gouge material, then we had the green material. So there was no chances, very low chances of mixing. So we could easily collect the gouge material from the granite boundary and we could measure it. So in our
No,
case, it was
that's
not a challenge.
fine. That's fine. But there should be some typical method of collecting sample from the gauge material. It seems.
Yes.
Otherwise, everything will be mixed.
Actually, so the amount of sample required is very little in this case. So we can just collect a few milligram of sample is required. So in our case, it was not very problem because we collected it itself from the layer and the vertical banding was very prominent. So we did not face any problem of like mixing of the material.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I have many more things to ask you, but this open for the audience. I hope there will be more queries from other members.
Thank you, sir. Shreyasi, I have one quick question.
Yes, sir.
I think one of your slide you have mentioned that the fault is formed at around 250 degrees centigrade to 300 degrees centigrade, right?
Uh, yes, yes,
And the depth is around 1 kilometer, right?
yes.
Yeah. So at such a shallow depth, why you are getting such high temperature like 250 to 300 degrees centigrade? Is it related to your like frictional heating or epithermal fluid flux or what?
This was in case of the Kiryat Shmona fault, which is one of the major strand of the Dead Sea fault. And we got this temperature range from the twinning that we observed in the calcite. So in this case, the depth is about 0.5 kilometer, but it experienced a very high strain and high frictional heating. That is expected in case of a plate boundary fault. And then later it got exhumed at the surface. So from that perspective, I'm saying that because of the twinning evidence, we can mark the temperature, which is greater than 250 actually, greater than 250 to 300 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so you are saying that the high temperature is because of frictional heating,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Okay. So, but the twinning in calcite can also change if you add extra fluid into the system, right? So,
yes.
can we use those twinning as a like temperature proxy in your case?
Yes, certainly. We did not use it in this case, but there are several studies where they have used it. That is a very common thing to do.
Okay.
But in our case, we just focused on the twinning from a temperature perspective to constrain the temperature.
Okay.
Constant means just
So,
constraining between 120 to 180, right?
No, sir. It was. This is for the Kiryat. Actually, I mentioned so many temperatures. It might be a bit confusing for the listener. But in case of Kiryat Shmona fault, the temperature range was greater than 250 to 300 degrees Celsius, which is uh, evident for this kind of plate boundary faults because it forms a major strand of the Dead Sea fault. And yes, that is what I mean.
okay. One more doubt.
Yes.
Your Dead Sea fault is it a like a transfer fault?
Yes, it has a transform segment, and in this, if we come down to the southern part, we see a lot of normal faulting also.
Okay. Okay,
Yes.
so it basically transfer your stress from your spreading center to your convergent boundary to the north.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Now, if we look at the Dead Sea basin, now once the Dead Sea fault is starting from the Dead Sea Rift, actually, it continues down to the Dead Sea Rift. When we reach the Dead Sea basin, we can see that the fault actually branches out. One branch passes through Jordan, one branch passes through Israel. So the branch which is passing through Israel shows evidence of both strike slip movement and oblique slip fault. And the transform nature is more along the branch which passes through Jordan, actually.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Uh,
Any more queries?
yes. Any more queries?
Yeah, please go ahead,
Please go
Anubhav.
ahead, sir. Yeah. Anubhav.
Shreyashidi, thank you for the amazing talk that you just gave. I have two questions.
Yes.
First of all, in a slide you showed that magnetite converts to magnemite at 120 to 180 degrees Celsius, and magnemite converts to 120 to goethite at 120 to 180 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
So I was not able to understand that part. Like, what is? I was not able to understand. Can you please repeat that part,
Okay,
please?
I will go back to that slide. Just a moment. I think you are talking about this thing.
Yes.
This thing, right?
Yes.
So
Yes. Yes.
this is basically when we are talking about shallow crustal faults, and this is a surface structure. Nahafi's fault is a surface structure. So if we think generally the temperature can't exceed 200 to 250 degrees Celsius.
Hmm.
However, we say that this temperature range is between 120 to 180 degrees Celsius. This is related to frictional heating, and this can happen due to geometric asperities along the fault surface. However, this frictional heating is also very localized, and the fluid activity is also very localized. So, therefore, we see this kind of goethite coatings discretely on the fault surface. So, this is not a continuous coating. Now, coming to the reaction, if we have a precursor magnetite at this temperature range, it can generate an intermediate phase, which is the magnemite, through solid state diffusion, and this process is called magmatization of magnetite. Now, this intermediate phase, under the presence of fluids and frictional heating, can change to goethite. That is what I was trying to say. Is it clear
Okay.
now?
Okay.
And this
So,
basically what
okay.
happens, the magnemite dissolves in the fluid and the goethite gets precipitated. So this is what we call the dissolution and precipitation reaction.
Okay, so at 120 to 180 degrees Celsius, at that temperature, magnetite is converting to magnemite, and in
Yes.
places where fluid is present, that magnemite
Yes.
is also converting to
Yes.
goethite. So
Yes.
in patches, you are getting the goethite.
Yes, actually, we got goethite only. We could not find this intermediate phase. So we expect that this conversion took place pretty fast.
Okay,
Wherever they got the fluid, they could convert it to goethite. So again, we found this goethite coating very close to. Now we have some silica enriched fluid within the fractures, but the amount is very less. Like only in some of the fractures we see, but the goethite coating is very closely associated to those fractures. Wherever we could see this kind of silica enriched fluid. So that was the interpretation.
okay. So you're saying that since the intermediate phase is not present, at that temperature, some fluid activity took place, and it was all converted to
Yes,
goethite.
the intermediate phase is not discernible through field observation. We could not understand. We could see a very thin, less than a 1 millimeter of coating at some places. But when we perform this low temperature SIRM measurements, then only we could decode that there is also magnemite once the goethite was demagnetized. So it is not discernible in naked eye.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
And the second question I had was because I don't know a lot about the AMS part. So you showed the distribution of points along a point or girdle or clusters. So I could not understand the like how the distributions are formed.
Okay. So basically, we are looking at the distribution of the K1, K2, K3 axis, right?
Yes.
And when I discussed about the AMS ellipsoid, I showed you that how the K1, K2 axis, it actually represents the magnetic foliation. Could you understand that part, or should I go back?
No, no, that's fine. That's fine. Okay.
Okay. So if this K1, K2 is basically my XY plane, then this distribution will represent my fault surface, right?
Yes.
Yes, so that is what I'm trying to say. And we find that this distribution of the K1, K2 axis along the fault surface, it's always parallel to the trend. So this fabric is called the fault-related deformation fabric. Now,
Yes.
as we move away from the fault, we see changes in this distribution. So from girdle, we are seeing clusters, and then as we move further away, we see isotropic distribution. So this basically helps us to understand the strain field variation across the fault surface.
Okay. Can you please explain how the clusters are forming? It's from
Clusters like these clusters,
yeah. After that, yeah, the second one, the
the second one.
three clusters that have been formed. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this type of clusters are related to the tectonic fabric. Now, how is it related? Basically, in case of triaxial state of strain, we will get this kind of orientation. So if we look at the fault plane solution here, this is the compression field and this is the tension field. So in other words, in this field, we should have the maximum compression axis, which is
Yes,
sigma 1.
yes,
So we
yes,
can infer that if sigma 1 is here, then which is the maximum shortening axis for the AMS is K3.
yes, yes,
So we find the K3 cluster here.
yes.
And because we are talking about triaxial state of strain, we will also see a K1 and a K2 cluster within the extension field.
Okay.
So
So
therefore, this defines as a tectonic fabric.
okay, okay, fine, fine. Thank you, thank you.
Sreyashi, I have one more doubt in this slide only. Uh,
Yes.
your along fault AMS measurement, so say Gardner distribution, right? And as we move away from your fault, you have a Gardner distribution up to your 80 meter. Then I think 2 to 3 kilometer, you have a random distribution, right?
Uh, this type of girdle is found at the fault surface, and if we move, in our case, we could find it up to 10 centimeter within the fault zone. If the strain field, now this is a general model, but in case if the strain field is very predominant, you can also see it up to 1 meter. So this is typically fault related deformation fabric. Now, as we move away from the fault zone, we can encounter different types of fabric depending upon the strain field. For example, if we are away from the fault zone and the rock type is in the rock type has suffered the tectonic strain field, then we can get this kind of a distribution. Now we can find undeformed rocks also. In such case, we will get isotropic distribution of the MS fabric. And in some cases, we can see the preservation of the primary fabric, so which is this case.
Okay.
So overall, this kind of AMS axis distribution can help us to understand that how the strain field is varying.
Okay. Oh, I got confused because you thought that second measurement between your 50 to 80 meter, you have
Yes.
shown that same Gardner distribution. But there is this is beyond your dimension, right?
You are talking about this
No,
one?
no, no. The second one.
This
Sorry,
one?
sorry. Yeah, this one.
No, this is not a girdle. This is a point distribution. The girdle is this one.
But still, that K2 and K1 are following a grid cycle, right? They're within a grid cycle. But still, they have
Yes,
two
yes,
clusters, but
yes. This is kind of an open cluster, but we
open
can't
cluster.
call this a girdle.
Yeah.
This is an open cluster. Now, this can happen due to changes in the triaxial state. We seldom get a very defined cluster. It's very rare in case of natural samples. Only here we got a very prominent cluster. If you look here, I'm not sure if you can see it. This one is a very well-defined cluster. Other than this, all of these clusters are very open clusters. So this is only possible when the sigma 1 component is exactly vertical. And it forms, so this is basically a deposition or compaction fabric. So we can have an idea that sigma 1 is vertical and the K1, K2 is well distributed along the periphery, horizontal plane.
okay.
Yes.
But my doubt is is it the distribution is related to your stress only? Because there is no such like observable deformation uh, in between your 50 to 80 meter, right? So that means there is no such grain rotation, So how the minerals got aligned to particular different cluster distributions that you are observing?
Okay, if I could understand your question well, the alignment of these minerals are related to the faulting process. So when I talked about the reorientation of the calcite grains, I meant reorientation along the fault surface. So
Ah,
basically, this reorientation will affect this fabric.
oh,
But if we move away from the fault surface, there can be
In that
further
case, it should be very thin. It cannot be a narrow zone if it is a fault surface, right?
Sorry, sir.
If it restricts only in the false only on the false surface, then it should not have a thickness of this. Or you are saying there are multiple false surface. Are
Yes, sir.
you?
Actually, there can be. Now, this is a model which I just made based on this, but the fault, if I look at the fault scarp, it is not just one plane. There are several segments.
So do you think
Now,
that at every plane the temperature attainment is same?
yes, in this case, it is more or less than 200 degrees Celsius. I cannot say that whether it is
This is your
exactly.
assumption. This is your assumption. This
Uh,
is the assumption, it seems, right?
sir, it
I
is.
don't think that every fracture surface you will have a same temperature. Do you think so?
Actually, we measured only one segment. We did not work on all of these segments because this is a 10-kilometer long escarpment. So it was
Yeah,
beyond my
that's true.
capacity.
But your temperature strain area is only 10 centimeter. That's what I was asking in the first instance. What is the
Okay.
thickness?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It
The
is 10
thickness is
centimeter,
only
but
10 centimeter.
yes, yes, sir.
So within that 10 centimeter, there are multiple fracture surface where you have displacement, and you are assuming that at every fracture place you have attained the same temperature. Do you think so?
Uh,
Did you mention? Did you do you think like that? I don't know.
no, actually, we determined the temperature based on the goethite coating, which is basically a superficial feature. We can't talk about the entire fault zone, or at least up to which this fault related strain is
Because
extending.
that's fine.
Can't talk.
That is agreeable because that's related to some chemical changes and formation of
Yes,
goethite.
yes.
Okay,
And this kind
but
of
if you,
thermochemical alteration is limited to the fault surface itself. We cannot see this alteration within the fault zone.
yeah, true.
Yes.
That's what that was the main idea for asking you that what was the depth of that
Okay.
strain.
I could not understand the question. Sorry.
Okay, so
okay.
yeah, Arun, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, my question was in between, like as you move away from your
Hello.
fault zone, right? So,
Yes.
for example, in this cartoon, you can see between your 50 meter and 80 meter,
Yes.
still you have K2 cluster, K1 cluster, and K3 cluster. Okay, they're
Yes.
all in
Yes.
clusters, right?
Yes.
My question is, as we move away from fault, okay, between 50 to 80 meter, this is beyond your damage zone, right? So,
Yes. This
yeah,
is
right?
beyond the
Beyond your
zone.
damage zone, okay. So,
Yes.
beyond your damage zone, why was still getting three clusters? So, like, we should expect that original bedding fabric, right?
Yes, but this is not exactly very case specific. Like what I'm trying to say is, when we move 50 to 80 meters away from the fault, we could also find tectonic fabric if the fault related deformation is not predominant. Now, this is a general model. This is not
Okay.
very specific to my case. But in general, if we move away from the fault zone, we can find the effect of the tectonic field. And in our case, luckily, we got such an exposure where we could see the preservation of the tectonic fabric. So this is related to the far field stress, and this is related to the local strain field.
Okay.
Hey, Arun,
Yes, sir.
I think it's fantastic going on.
Yes, yes.
I hope this sort of discussion should move on. But in the meantime, I think Dr. Gaurav Das is waiting.
Yes, 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 yes. Please,
I
please,
think
sir. Go ahead, sir.
he
Please go
he
ahead.
should go ahead. Yeah, Dr.
Thank you, sir. Sreyashi, it was a nice presentation. I got to know many things.
Thank
Since you are talking about fault-related deformation fabrics, I hope you recall the faults you have found in Chitradurga granite during your PhD work.
Yes,
So
yes.
as you can remember, those faults are sharp and there is hardly any gouge material. So can we apply this kind of fault related deformation fabric in that area?
Okay, so you are talking about the granites, right?
Yes, granites or any sort of
Any sort of
plutonic rocks
In
which
fact, in
have
fact,
sharp faults.
in fact, when I was doing my PhD, I had a discussion with Trinit sir regarding this. But getting a fabric depends on where you are collecting the sample from. So if you are able to collect a sample exactly from the fault surface, then you might get a fabric if there has not been any overprinting. So in our case, because this is Miocene faulting, we did not have any overprinting. So we were pretty sure that we will get the fault related fabric. But in case of Chitradurga, there can be overprinting. So it is very tricky, but there is always an option of trying.
Okay, thank you for that. And the second one, suppose in a intrusive rock, we are finding the same fault related deformation fabric, but there is no faulting. So can we say that this particular fabric is overall a flow related fabric?
Yes, of course. Like we can see any sort of fabric. We need to know about the literature, about the geology of the area to infer that fabric. So here, because we know about the existing fault surface from the literature, we could relate it to the fault. But if we do not have any fault surface, then that fabric can mean something else altogether. So this entire thing depends on the interpretation of how we interpret the MS fabric. It can be flow fabric, it can be related to any ductile deformation, anything.
ductile deformation, I agree.
Yes, yes,
But when you talk about the brittle deformation,
yes,
the material is incohesive,
yes.
then I am not that sure. This is my, at
Sir,
least I cannot imagine like that.
yes, sir, you are absolutely correct. And of course, you are correct in this way.
No,
Because, no, what I'm saying is that that is the reason why in the second project, when I discussed about the fault code, I told you that the material is incohesive. We could not perform any magnetic fabric analysis there. Sometimes we do perform AMS in incohesive material, but in that case, we need to use a plastic holder to maintain a preferred orientation. So that is a bit tricky. That is a bit difficult. But in this case, for this is a limestone block. So there was no incohesive material here. So we could easily drill and obtain a hard sample. So this
okay.
was not a problem here.
Okay, I think this person is there or not. Professor Anupam Chattopadhyay is there? No, he just left.
I think iron.
Oh, Ayan.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead,
Go
Ayan.
ahead.
Excellent listening to you, Sreyashi, after a long time.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to know something from you in this slide actually. So your AMS fabric is related to plastic deformation, right?
Yes.
So we should expect generally that the deformation of the strain should be strongest at the fault surface.
Yes.
So the alignment should be more there, but in this case we are seeing that the K1 is more aligned to a certain direction away from the fault, and it's showing girdle distribution right actually in the fault. So any idea what is causing this?
You have to repeat the question. Sorry, I could not understand your which
Okay, so
particular example are you
yes,
talking
I'm
about?
talking about the actually the on the fault surface, the
This one,
girdle you showed. Yes,
this
yes.
one, right? Yes.
So we should expect the strain to be maximum close to the fault, right?
Mhm.
So the alignment should be more in the fault surface compared to the damage zone or anywhere else. But here we are showing that the K1 is like in a girdle way distributed, but in a more strain situation, we should expect the K1 to be a cluster. What is causing this discrepancy?
It's a complicated question. If I could understand you clearly, you are talking about this particular like K1 distribution, right?
No,
Yes, yes.
what his question is, why this girdle is not a point?
Yes.
Okay, why this girdle is not a point?
Because this is the maximum, this is the plane where you can accumulate strain.
Yes.
But if it is a point, then how will we define the plane,
No,
first
I
of
think
all?
he's
Because the
asking.
K1, K2 AMS axis defines the magnetic fabric, magnetic
I
foliation.
Ah,
Yeah.
So here we are
But
talking about the
but
manifolds. Sorry.
seriously, the K1 is related to
cluster.
X, right? The
Yes.
lineation X in a fault plane, the X should be constant, or the slicken line or the maximum strain axis within the fault plane. It should be constant, especially if we see the earthquake slip vectors along this fault plane. The
Okay.
focal mechanism solution also shows a constant orientation. But here your K1 is oriented in a girdle way. So I'm not sure what is causing that.
Okay, so this data is from one core, like this is from multiple cores. So when we are talking about the K1, K2, K3, this is relative to one core. So if we take one set of data, it will be like the three axes obtained from one core. Now, when you are talking about this kind of cluster, if I could understand you, if there is only one phase of deformation where we are getting one set of slicken lines, then it is expected to be a perfect or very well defined cluster. But that is not the case here. There can be multiple slicken lines, multiple events of faulting. So we can't expect a perfect cluster in all cases.
No, seriously, I don't agree. I
it's
agree.
a it's a large scale fault, right? So the plates are moving. So yes, we can have local reorientation of the stress. Maybe that's what you are talking about. I get that. But if we look at the larger scale, the kinematics is more or less the same along this fault.
I
But
think
yeah,
he,
the scale you are working on, like core level, centimeter level, there the stress can change. Yeah, I agree.
Yes, I'm
anyway.
sorry. Maybe I need to rethink about the question.
I think maybe Santanu sir correct me. I think this is more related to your fault asperities, right? So yeah, local minute scale changes that will affect your guide.
In
Yes, means
fact,
we have collected the codes from a different, like it is a segment, but it is not always a planar surface. So we have many ups and downs along the surface, and we collected the codes from different locations. So each of these codes gives us three AMS axes, K1, K2, K3, and this girdle is defined by the overall orientation of the K1 and the K2 axis. So, if I could understand clearly, when we are talking about a particular slicken lineation, it will be a perfect cluster if it is related to one particular event. But this is not related here exactly. This is not what we are representing here. This is an overall orientation which is found throughout the fault surface of from each of the samples. So that can't exactly give me the orientation uh, of the slicken lineation or the maximum stretching axis. It is an average distribution.
hey,
Yeah,
Dr. Safi,
yeah,
Dr. Tridib is
yeah,
waiting.
Tridip, yeah.
No, actually, this is in response to Ion. Ion, I think it's better to look at the number of the samples. I think it's not written here. So, what normally AMS does. So, for a particular analysis, for a particular space, we need to collect the sample from which we need to collect at least four cores, right? So it's not that that four cores will give you the same data. So normally we take the 95% confidence level, right? So whatever data you are looking at here, look at the K3, okay? This is the pole of K1, K2, right? So this is following a line, right? This K1 and K2. So that means they are not deviated much. And as Sri pointed out, that the fault zone is how much is kilometer? Uh,
10 kilometers, but this
yeah.
segment is
So there could be the local variations, definitely. I mean, definitely the strike would not be the same. And when the strike will change, I mean, that the same thing will deviate from its, the average. I think this could be the reason. There are many reasons. So whatever this says, I mean, I read that paper only, so I never worked in that area. But from that data, I think if you can tell the number of data, that is helpful. And if you look at the confidence, I mean, if you provide that confidence level in
Yes,
this
yes.
pseudonet, that would help. Right?
Okay, I will definitely do that. Actually, the number of data is close to from each of the locations. If I remember clearly, it was close to 200 something.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay. So, any more queries from our audience or suggestion from Dr. Tridip, your supervisor?
No, now she is independent. Right. So, one thing I'd like to know from Sreyashi, because this is also new for me. I mean, for me. Uh, so now, if you look at any fault, so this is the kind of shear fracture, right? So if you look at any dike, let's say, I mean, the width of the dike, let's say in meter scale, right? 1 meter or 2 meter. So this is purely tensile one, right? Now, if you do the same thing, I mean, away from the dike, you take systematic sample and keep on collecting towards the dike. Then this girdle to this isotropic, this variation would be there. What's your suggestion? I mean, your opinion?
Mm, I have not worked on dikes, sir, but
Don't have
I think
idea. Yes, I'm asking.
I think there should be some relation, uh, but it depends on what type of dike, where I
The mode of
in the con-
fracturing is entirely different. I mean, the dike is purely, let's say, this is assume that this is a purely mode one, and this is shear fracture. So that's what I'm asking.
It could be, but I'm not very aware. Like I need to check.
But
I've not
if
worked.
you're working in that domain, I think this could be great, idea for working in future.
But I think there are some papers on AMS fabric from dike swarms, if I can recall. But I'm not very sure about this.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Many more questions. I think, sir, we should conclude the
If
session.
there is no more
Yeah.
queries, then we should give a big round of applause.
Yes,
to
yes.
Sreyashi.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think, sir, we should conclude the session, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Have a
So
nice
with this,
weekend to all.
we'll meet again next month.
Next one, definitely, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Okay. Bye. Ciao.